this is it for now. Welcome back to day 2. We're doing this one in English. Our panel this morning is Decentering German International Relations Perspectives from the Global North, South, and East. And we have 4 papers, but 6 presenters, kind of, I think. I'm not quite sure. If everybody's here, some of them are online. And we're going to start in the order of the program. Everybody gets their 10 minutes. I have my little signs with 2 and 0, and 0 means finish. And then we have Nicole giving us comments on all the papers. And I see a lot of notes over there, so I think that's going to actually happen. Okay, so without further ado, welcome, and let's start with Siddharth. Do you want to come up here, or you want to speak from there? How do you feel? Do you have a preference of some sort?
Yeah, maybe I think it's there.
I might sit.
Yeah, sounding is fine.
Okay, off you go.
Okay, so I guess there have been a lot of discussions on how Europe is perceiving the war. I guess it's nice to have alternative perspectives on Saturday morning. Maybe to raise more questions than I raised in the roundtable yesterday, and maybe elaborate more on that. So I've been working on peace and conflict, and of course post-colonial hierarchies in peace and conflict, and that's something which also makes me think of how do we look at war and how do we perceive that, and especially in the dominant discourse of this warmongering that is going on. So I just wanted to start with this paper with a small quote by Mary Andrew, and she says that I'm washing my face before bed while a country is on fire. It feels to wash my face and dumb not to. It has never been this way, and it has always been this way. Someone has always clinked a cocktail glass in one sphere, as someone loses a home in another, while someone falls in love in the same apartment building where someone grieves. The fact that suffering, mundanity, and beauty coincide is unbearable and remarkable. So this quote encapsulates the plurality of experiences of people located in different geographies, which in turn shapes their perceptions and also the decision to make choices. My source of information on the Ukraine crisis comes from the media, mostly based in the West, but also from India, where I spent some time during the crisis. It meant also that I was in a comfortable position and had the choice to turn off the news and completely distance myself from the ongoing state of affairs at an individual level. The people in Ukraine who have been directly impacted do not have the choice, and this is their lived experience, something which should be prioritized in any discussion on Ukraine, so as not to marginalize and silence those voices, which often get lost in the state and sovereignty discourse that is prevalent in IR. So keeping this in mind, I have analyzed the media discourses which existed in India and Germany, the 2 locations where I have been during the Ukraine crisis. So while there was no disagreement on the fact that Russia is the aggressor, the way it has been reported in Germany versus in India varies significantly, as will be the case of people based outside Europe. I've also been asked often about the neutral stance that India and other countries in the global south took, viewed as, so this neutral stance was viewed as support for Russia and against US and European stance at a general level. And if I think it's justified, I mean, one country cannot represent the diversity of even the global south, but most of the countries have followed a similar stance, barring few exceptions like Kenya. So this very short piece, I'm trying to look at these different dilemmas and concerns which countries in the global south have, and why they have sort of not aligned with the so-called West against Russia, and why these perceptions and perspectives differ. So I basically talk about this privilege of choice, which certain countries have and certain countries do not have. And we know that because of the Ukraine war, I mean, or the Russian war on Ukraine, this has bifurcated this post-COVID world between global north which outrightly supported Ukrainian war efforts against Russia, and those who are a bit more cautious about the sanctions regime. I think there was a lot of discussion on sanctions yesterday, and also the tough stance, which was not really sort of appreciated by the global South. So except for the US, UK, Canada, Switzerland, Japan, and few other countries, a lot of countries have taken a bit more complicated sort of stance on that. And this contrast between geographies could not have been more striking, also due to the lack of understanding about the privilege of choice between those who have and those who don't, primarily countries of the global South. There's a Swahili saying which can be translated as, when the elephants make love, the grass gets crushed. When the elephants fight, the grass gets crushed. And the grass can be metaphorically used for the global South in general, and of course, Ukraine in particular here, as both their choices have been limited in terms of their responses. Ukraine has been trying to defend its sovereignty and the lives of its people against Russia. The global South has been trying to minimize the impact of the war on its people due to food and energy shortages caused. So of course, these difficulties of positions and contexts make it difficult for the global South to have a clear choice of supporting the West on the Ukraine crisis. I can talk about the global South and I mean, the terminology and others later. I mean, for this, I'm just basically using for those countries who had sort of histories of colonial past. So this leads me to sort of the second point, where there's a very clear divide, or at least it has been portrayed like the West versus the rest divide. And of course, many countries, if you look at the voting behaviors in the General Assembly, Security Council, or Human Rights Council resolutions, a lot of countries have sort of supported the West, but also many have not, and they have abstained from the voting. But that doesn't mean that they have sympathized with Russia as a, but they have sympathized with the plight of Ukrainian people. So they basically say that even if we do not support or vote in favor of the West, if we look at the explanation of voting, the EOV as it is called, it very clearly marks, I mean, without naming, it very clearly talks about aggression and how it's going to impact the countries which are there. But where they have resisted is that they have not followed the Western demands that they make costly sacrifices by cutting off economic ties with Russia to uphold this rules-based order. It has sort of got a bit more allergic reaction from these countries, and they say that the rules-based order has not been rules-based in reality. Instead, it has been allowed prominent powers like the US to violate international law with impunity, whether it was Iraq, Afghanistan, former Yugoslavia, and so many other countries. As one of the former Indian National Security Advisor, Shiv Shankar Menon, argues, he said that most Asian capitals regard the conflict as a war over the European security order, not an epochal global configuration. So if we really see, they basically, the argument that a lot of countries are making is that getting entangled in this appeal does not appeal, getting entangled in this discourse does not appeal to many countries in the global South, and certainly not for the sake of restoring a flawed international order, which is designed by the West, which also gets an undue advantage out of this order, which of course it has shaped and at times breached too. So it raises these questions of who basically is setting the agenda in international politics, who benefits from it, who is not part of the agenda setting or excluded from it, only to face the ramifications of the norms, regimes, positions, and order that has been discussed. Now, coming to the specificities of this, when we look at the concerns and dilemmas of countries in the global South, I mentioned that it's not a homogeneous category, and the responses to Ukraine crisis have shown that too. But there are certain elements which bind most of the countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America together, especially their colonial past. So I'm looking at the time.
Don't look at the time.
So just quickly highlighting, what are the primary concerns. The first concern is, of course, food security. And the UN Secretary General also talked about the hurricane of hunger as early as mid-March. And according to FAO, global food prices could still rise by as much as 22%, reaching the highest level ever. And in countries of the global North, food prices do not fall as heavily as in the countries of the global south, where a large portion of people's income is spent on daily meals. And I mean, I can get into the details later. The rising, of course, it impacts disruption of supply chains, and it also impacts in the price of fertilizer and limits the supply of homegrown foods. So this in turn impacts inflation and economic activities, which pushes many countries into further debt trap, which so many countries in the south are already part of. Of course, it means that the low-income African households are now in energy poverty or have no access to electricity. And as world's second largest producer of gas and third largest of oil, Russia is adept at manipulating its energy leverage, and it's blaming the West, of course, for the rising fuel and energy costs at the moment. So this is also, so these are a couple of points about the dilemmas which are there, but also dilemmas over energy security were also induced by the Russia-Ukraine standoff, have to be linked to broader questions about climate change, which we are not talking about at all here now. Apart from the global humanitarian concerns, the media discourses in the West have also not taken into account the geopolitical contexts in which certain countries are situated. For example, many countries from the global south do not see Russia as a threat, unlike Europe and US. India and some other countries, I can give examples later, consider China as a threat and often as an aggressor and a cause of concern. And some of them still want to maintain their relations with Russia to be able to balance balance the rising threat from China. And this has, of course, led more discussion about defense expenditure and less on humanitarian efforts and the human cost of war. And I feel this is a very dangerous precedent, not boding well for international peace and security. 1 minute. And when we look at the concluding sort of argument that I'm trying to make is that this, of course, exposed the fault lines that exist in the international system between countries in terms of who gets impacted and how. It has, of course, led us to rethink foundational questions in international politics about security, sovereignty, interventionism, democracy, autocracy, human rights, and global order. But it also leads us to re-examine the magnitude of cost of war in terms of humanitarian crisis and so many other costs which follow. Interestingly now, of course, war in one place cannot be limited, and it's going to go beyond borders, and that's something which is cause of concern. Of course, this means that whatever the outcome may be, it's definitely sort of changes the whole understanding of global peace and security infrastructure. So my biggest fear is that few years down the line, Ukraine crisis will be relegated to the pages of the same history book which contains Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Kosovo, and Mali. And my biggest hope is that I'm proven wrong and peace will prevail over war. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, thank you so much. Next, we have David.
Yes.
Do you want to?
Yeah, why not?
And try not to look at my counter.
We'll try. All right, good morning, everyone. I cannot offer a perspective, a non-German perspective, so I'm primarily going to look at theory and underscore a few points that were already made yesterday in various discussions. I will therefore try to keep it short and just a tad on the polemic side. My name is David Bitterling. I'm currently doing my PhD at the University of Frankfurt with Gunther, who's kindly here as well, where I'm researching justification narratives and civilian victimization in 21st century air power. That is, however, not what I want to draw from today. Instead, I would like to go back a few more years to, I believe, 2018, originally to my master thesis about the great Soviet-Ukrainian famine of the 1930s, the Holodomor. I will do so as a form of a summary teaser, so to speak, of my paper to echo a few of the points that were made yesterday. Points about theoretical openness, about engaging with history, and about the, I think, more than pressing need to engage with academic voices from the very places we talk about, we theorize about. And I believe in 2022 and beyond, doing this will mean, as Maren Hofius has pointed out in her opening address yesterday, it will mean revitalizing area studies to give room for Ukrainian scholarships in our IR discussions, and to listen and to read history in order to, I think, acquire a deeper familiarity with our research object, because this familiarity, I think, in some papers and other publications and interviews and so on that one could read in recent months, I would say that this has been fairly lacking to a degree. Beyond this lack of familiarity with the research object, and I would say that these two are very much connected, there's another thing that I would slightly polemically argue went wrong to a degree, how some corners of IR have theorized Russian aggression. And these points, at least I think almost all of them, were raised yesterday as well, which is that IR, when it is understood as a science of schools and explanatory paradigms that are either right or wrong, and when we engage in these full-on paradigmatic fights that were mentioned yesterday, not just useful conflicts that may be productive, but these full-on fights, then we do run into a problem of explanatory power that is greatly diminished. We can see this, I believe, in IR's treatment of Russia, where unfortunately, very unfortunately, monoparadigmatic approaches are also, of course, offering monocausal explanations. There is in this, of course, a degree of polemic overstatement. And I do agree with the caveats yesterday that things are not quite as bad as they seem when looking at the quote of Hefried Mögenklau, even internationally at, for instance, Stephen Wald. Things are not, I'm sure, as bad as they might seem. Nevertheless, looking at non-Ukrainian IR and IR adjacent scholarship, and there's not just a critique because I mentioned of realism, Russia, Ukraine, and my former subject matter, the Holodomor, are drastically under-researched. The history is underrepresented in analyses of current aggression, of current Russian. In my paper, I like to use Joseph Nye's bonfire allegory. I quote, "Piling up logs is a deep cause. Adding kindling a paper is an intermediate cause. And striking a match is the precipitating cause," end quote. Very few analyses that I have come across in recent months beyond Ukrainian scholarship and the Ukrainian diaspora have been open to look at anything beyond precipitating and intermediate causes. Even Joseph Nye himself, from this quote, was in his analysis, only goes back as far as the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And even while I believe, and I will point out, that post-colonial perspectives could have had major benefits in understanding some of the deep causes of, looking at the time, deep causes of the reasons and the forms, the various forms of current Russian aggression, to understand the complex relationship between both countries. Post-colonial thought beyond Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora has for quite some time been more than hesitant to openly address Soviet imperialism, or what can be called supposedly Soviet imperialism. I quote a leading famine researcher from Ukraine, Lyudmila Hlinevich. The Holodomor has long been marginal to discussions of colonialism and empire. To illustrate why I believe that both history and the consideration of Ukrainian insights are imperative, I will use a small example. Today, yesterday, and so on, we're looking back at nearly 9 months of open war, some would say. At the same time, US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin recently found it necessary to restate, I quote, "The war started in 2014. Both statements are true, of course, within their own realms. But if we were to base our analyses on either of them, I think we would get a rather insufficient explanation from both, or from any analysis that is only based on one of these versions. The Russian-Ukrainian relationship did not start in 2022, did not start in 2014, or even in the early 90s. Russian imperialism did not come around the corner recently, but instead is part of a longer historically influenced pattern. There's a sort of truism a old quote about violence. The tree remembers, the axe forgets. According to everything we know about trauma, we had an excellent talk about trauma yesterday in the other room. At least the first part of this quote is certainly true. Ukraine has not forgotten its trauma. It has not forgotten the 1930s. It has not forgotten famine. And it has not forgotten Soviet rule. But as specifically Ukrainian post-colonial scholarship has been demonstrating for decades, neither has Russia forgotten. The X does not forget, to overuse this quote. Instead, there's excellent research from Ukraine, the Ukrainian diaspora, that highlights the primacy, the continuous primacy of empire and imperialism in the Russian relationship towards Ukraine. There are patterns of thinking and patterns of violence that get repeated. An imagined cultural hierarchy is translated into most often killing civilians, attempted cultural domination, attempted ethnic cleansing, to use that word potentially, and attempted ethnic assimilation, both at home and in another territorial state. And as well, as we've seen before and leading up to and potentially after the grain agreement with the help of Turkey, food being used as a weapon when often other weapons become too expensive or complicated to use. I think the historical comparison is probably clear here. It is, though, only that, it's a comparison, a starting point, I think, if you will, for how to theorize conflict, how to theorize this specific conflict in ways that are comprehensive, that are more than just a reflection of what Friedrich Kartoffel called a desire to win over other paradigms or schools. There is no one theory, I think, that can explain Russian aggression, but a variety of them is needed. Without realism, without constructivism, without liberalism, without post-colonial thought, I would say we do get an incomplete picture. There's a term for that by Peter Katzenstein and Rutrasil. Most here will probably know what I'm getting at. It's eclectic theorizing. I quote, "We need to trespass deliberately and liberally across competing research traditions," end quote. But I believe we do not just need to trespass in the sense that realists also go and read constructivists and the other way around. Instead, the trespassing needs to be lateral across theoretical, institutional, and international divides, but it also needs to be temporal. It, or rather we, need to incorporate history, a close and in-depth reading of history, especially the history written by the very people we speak about. Thank you so much.
On the timing also. Our next participant is online, Raphael. I'm trying to be able to really give you my 2-minute warning, so maybe you can.
I have a stopwatch ready.
Okay, excellent.
So thank you very, very much for having me. And I have to start with saying I'm very sorry that I cannot be with you in Hamburg because right now I'm sitting in a hotel lobby in Jerusalem. But nevertheless, great that there has been this option for taking part online. Thank you very much to the organizing team for that. And also, before I get started, I actually can add to 3 things that David was mentioning. So I'm also providing an exclusively German perspective to this panel. Also a Frankfurt perspective, since I'm also doing my PhD at Frankfurt with Nicole. And thirdly, because I can seamlessly tie into what David has been saying in terms of actually looking at neighboring disciplines, related disciplines, in terms of attaining a better understanding of right now the conflict in Ukraine, the war against Ukraine, and in what I would actually tend to call getting the broader picture. So what I have reckoned when I was actually trying to write down these very tentative thoughts that I wouldn't dare to call a paper in the end, rather than some loose ends that need some ordering, is that 2 things apparently happen at the same time. On one side, many of us, at least many of whom are also in the room, as I know, we tend to think in interdisciplinary ways. We seem to share the idea or the conviction that particularly looking at very complex situations, constellations, such as the war in Ukraine, it might be necessary and it might be important to to look beyond, to look beyond your own fence and to actually take a step forward. At the same time, sometimes it seems as if we are, in my view at least, and this is just, of course, a very subjective approach to that, we get lost along the way in terms of how we actually do that. And when I actually saw the title of this conference, I was actually drawn right into this thinking yet again. So this question of how to approach interdisciplinarity as a discipline, and particularly as German IR scholars. And so I will be very brief with that, actually, in saying that what I've written down in this little piece is nothing new. I think it's definitely not the golden ticket to find a solution to these questions that have been popping up every now and then in terms of how can we work in interdisciplinary ways, how can we engage with neighboring disciplines, how we can actually make use of each other's expertise. And David was, I think, completely right in mentioning history, for example, particularly now in the context of Ukraine and Russia and their relationship. I would actually add, the distinct focus Eastern European studies, for example, in this particular context. The question for me, however, was, well, where do we stand and how do we actually go about these different and possible modes of interaction with neighboring disciplines as a discipline, as of ourselves. And what I just came up with very generic in order really to instill this discussion, or actually to fuel this discussion that has been going on actually for quite a while. And I'm also looking at that from the other side of the fence with one foot actually in the international law camp, where we have the same discussion taking place, so how to engage more meaningfully with international relations scholarship. I actually tried to sort of structure this sort of the state of play a little bit, which led me to these 4 hypotheses that I actually proposed in this little piece. And so on one side, I think the first step for us as German IR scholarship, as the community, would actually be to to engage in probably more self-reflexivity. What do I mean by that? Well, that of course we have to answer ourselves whether we have had blind spots when it comes, for example, to the notion of Ukrainian-Russian relations, and whether we have actually missed on developments, whether we have missed on contingencies where IR expertise would have been important to bring to the table. Also in terms of how we actually contribute towards public and political debates. And so this very act of self-scrutinizing, I think, is something that at times at least we can engage a bit more in. And I think that many of us already do that, actually questioning ourselves. Where do we actually lack expertise? Where haven't we focused enough? Where do we probably need more understanding of cognate disciplines approaches towards what we actually share as objects of research, and then actually try to think a bit more actually about how we could meaningfully engage with one another. And here actually a caveat applies, namely that this is not meant to actually let go of, let's say, our own IR scholar, self-identity. And this is something that Marty Koskinen with regard to international law once said, in the sense that, well, in the end of the day, we still are lawyers. And we should remain lawyers. We are not meant to become scholars of IR, sociology, economics, or whatever. At the end of the day, we are lawyers, and we should keep that. However, we should be intellectually flexible and willing to incorporate different thoughts, different understandings, different methodology in particular. And just one word on methodology. This is something that I've worked on a bit recently in a project where we actually tried to really get an understanding of how do international law and international relations scholars actually perceive certain terms of art in completely different ways. What is the connotation? What is the meaning? What are the dimensions? The notional dimensions behind. And this is just one example that I guess all of reading cross-disciplinary, so to speak. But once we have done that, actually, so once we have come to this point of actually identifying where we potentially lack expertise or where we need more focus, then it's about actually thinking about also new and different formats, I think, and different fora for actually engaging in interdisciplinary means and ways with neighboring disciplines, and then think about how we can actually attain and then also disseminate this the knowledge that is generated through these kind of corporations. And also, I think this is very important, or has become ever more important also in the war in Ukraine context, how we can actually disseminate this knowledge towards also new audiences. So across, the classical circles of addressees, with our own turf, like our own disciplinary turf. And this then would actually also mean to think about, new publication formats, new outlets, new kinds of actually, just dispersing this then truly interdisciplinary knowledge. And finally, and I think this is the key for success in terms of really establishing that even more than we've already done. And this is something I would actually also need to flag. I think this is not meant to say that, we do not engage in interdisciplinary discourse. It's just meant to say that probably we need to scrutinize the way how and how often we do that a bit more thoroughly. And I think one core takeaway should be that we also then need to think about how to institutionalize that a bit more. I mean, it doesn't always have to be like, the big DFG research cluster, but that we actually establish structures that make it easier for, constantly engaging in interdisciplinary exchange and actually making it more normal, if you wish, than it already is. So in the end of the day, this is nothing new, and I'm aware of that. My intention actually was to actually, make use, is not meant to sound cynical, but to make use of the situation that we are in, where it's apparently necessary to get the broader picture, and where there are definitely benefits of extending one's own view to actually re-engage in this act of self-reflexivity in terms of enhancing our understanding of interdisciplinary collaboration. Because I personally, at least, believe that it's always good to have the broader picture. I think we all want to have the broader picture. This is not meant to be, for IR scholars to become international lawyers or sociologists or the other way around. Definitely not. It's not about formalities. It's not about, taking away something from, from someone else. It's just, I think, in the best interest of really understanding these very, very complex developments that we are currently facing, and where it simply makes sense to mutually benefit from each other's expertise and knowledge. And with that, I think I yield the remaining 20 seconds back to you, and thank you very, very much for your attention and for having me, even though only online.
Back to physical presentations, Dennis.
Thank you. In this panel. I'm saying we only have men in this panel, and that's true.
So that's why they put us in, maybe.
Chair, very nice.
Ready?
Yeah, we're full.
Okay. All right, Dennis.
Thank you all. It's great to participate at an event after a few years. A few months ago in Athens, we had the first European ISA conference. Now, after 2 years of having been in Germany, it's very nice to be at a German event. Some 59 years ago, actually, the first event in Germany that focused on IR took place exactly on April 25, 1963 at Heidelberg. It was the first time that there was a specific one-day debate on the structure of German IR. More pertinently, it focused on German foreign policy studies, but these were like the starting points of the emergence of post-Second World War German or West German IRs. So there is this kind of long tradition. My paper, on the other hand, deals with the idea of Germanocentrism in international relations scholarship in Germany, and how we can find some ways to get rid of this Germanocentric scholarship in Germany. I use some concepts that also have their roots in the Mannheimian takes of Morgenthau, like the idea of standortgebunden, and the idea that certain political ideas, certain analysis on world politics have to emerge in a context that is engaged with the given political conditions and has to answer to those challenges. So in that sense, standortgebunden, or currently we can also use positionality, a bit standpoint analysis a la the feminist scholarship. But the point is that even with that kind of an approach that focuses on standpoint or standortgebunden analysis, in German case, there's a distinct position which I want to elaborate on. So the position pertains in my case to the assertion, or let's say assumption, that there's a prevailing dynamic in German IR that has created a more Germanocentric analysis of world politics, and related to also gave birth to a scholarship which is much more narrow in its research agenda. I also engaged in more detail with some recent scholarship on German IR, written analysis by Riss, by Stefek, and some others. And the main problem in their analysis, I assume, or I assert, is that they don't look at the categories, which are the main categories in German IR. Actually, they do at those categories, look at those categories, but they don't differentiate between the paradigmatic connections that relate to those categories. So at the end of the day, when you look at the categories, they are very much connected to three main issue areas, including norm studies, international legal order, and also the question of international institutions relating also to European Union. I'm very much triggered positively, also intellectually triggered by the debates since yesterday, and 2 points emerged. I think one of them concerns the issue of German foreign policy and its impact on German IR scholarship, and there are some other perhaps expectations related to the fact that there could or should be a distinct German IR school. So I don't agree with those positions, because I think the general problem, or let's say dynamic that leads to this Germanocentrism, emerges from the background conditions that prevail in the post-reunification, post-Cold War German society, and related domestic as well as foreign political dynamics that have shaped the agenda and the position. And there are some brief analysis about the dominance of liberal idealist and constructivist scholarship in German IR, but at the end of the day, I even could assert that the general background itself at a meta-theoretical level is very much shaped by this Germanocentrism, so that we deal with the IR theories actually as epiphenomena of this situation. To concretize perhaps my assertion, the Germanocentrism I refer is not one of those usual suspects a la Eurocentrism or the emerging Sinocentric approach, but it actually concerns the idea that we are dealing with some social and political expectations that prevail in this post-reunification, post-Cold War Germany. So they include presumptions that originate from the German federal system with its focus on democracy, the balancing between various actors and institutions, a rightful emphasis on Nazi legacy as the temporal other of the German society, and extend on an international dimension Germany's role as a now peaceful, regional, and at sometimes also global player, among others. But these self-perceptions, I argue, and at times expectations, don't reflect the state the world is in, nor do they necessarily serve as factors shared by other societies and thus validated by others for Germany. This is not even a case of intra-Western divergence, it's not a case of Germany being different from others. It is actually a case of Germany being different from others, because we don't see, as also was said yesterday in some comments, I remember, that we don't see this situation in the French, British, Greek, or US IR. So there is a very specific German situation, which I claim derives from a German exceptionalism without its name. So it's a situation of German exceptionalism that is not even often explicitly acknowledged, but it's there and influencing the scholarship. So I see this German exceptionalism as the problem that generates Germanocentrism in IR community in Germany. So this is then the factor that shapes the research agenda in Germany. And in line with that, I also refer briefly to the idea of civilian power, among others, that has shaped also IR scholarship, and also I assert is related to this broader agenda. So there is a societal, political dimension, the perhaps post-reunification, post-Cold War kind of relaxations, no problems that we see in the case of France or Greece or the US. So there is this kind of also lack of problems that to a certain extent structures the research agenda, or at least used to structure until this very political Zeitenwende that now we are discussing about whether it will also influence IR's own Zeitenwende in Germany. So what do I offer as a possible range of recommendations or agenda points? First of all, I ask for not going to the direction of policy relevance. There have been some recent works by scholars such as San Bernardi, for instance, and earlier Kuklik. They showed us that this focusing on policy relevance doesn't work. If it works, it's more in the sense of let's say ex post facto legitimation. So there are the political ideas and then scholars contribute, but the agenda is already there. So that's not, I suggest, a good way to go ahead. And therefore, we should not also go into the direction of fad and fashion, because that's also related to policy relevance issues. The problem would be that our agenda would be too much structured by given short duration issues. So what can we do? Also, some other contributions suggested similar lines of moves. First of all, to broaden our research agenda to go for more collaborative research and also to internationalize German IR. How? You can do it in a way that goes to non-Western directions, but even within the European case, I haven't seen much of collaboration, for instance, between German and French IR scholars. I mean, you can think about the work of Bagui or of Battistel and other people in France who are not necessarily in those geopolitically structured schools, which will be for obvious historical reasons due to the House of Anti's legacy, it's problematic for Germans to follow. So there are all these other options which kind of remain unused. Another option will be also to, through these cooperations, to focus more on history, on the aspects of non-Western parts of the world. And at the 1963 meeting about which I talked at the very start, you find all those references, all those discussions, analysis. The first professor at FU Berlin, Löwenthal, was speaking about the post-colonial world, Western, Southern, Northern, Eastern issues at the same time. One final point in my 15 seconds. Also, you can go to differentiate between the idea of a German IR discourse, which I suggest should not actually exist, and the different possibility of a IR community in Germany that includes also non-Germans who could perhaps also bring in different socialization backgrounds and therefore enrich the scholarship. Thank you very much.
Everybody has been really wonderful on time. So Nicole, you got your chance to make first. An hour now.
Yeah.
All right.
First of all, thank you very much. These were 4 really thought-provoking discussion pieces, and they are discussion pieces. So all the presentations that you heard now are based on very small papers yet. And that means there's a lot of room to develop. And there's also some more provocative statements, I would say, in the papers that I would like to engage with, because I think it's up for discussion. I'm not agreeing with the papers in every instance, and I would like, of course, to touch on these disagreements. And of course, there's also peculiarity with the panel of, with the title of the panel and the papers. As you have seen from or heard from the presentations, they are not really about the global south or decentering. They're very much centered on German IR field. But let's see what we do with it. I will start in the order of the presentations, and then we'll see how far I get. So I'm starting with Siddharth's paper, which is a very, very interesting paper, and the only one who is really explicitly taking up a global South perspectives on the Ukraine war, here with a specific focus on the comparison of the Indian discourse, Indian media discourse, and the German media discourse. However, reading through this paper, I was not sure what to make out of it for the field of IR, because the paper starts from colonial legacies and post-colonial realities of the Global South to explain the divergent responses from the Global South to the war in Ukraine. However, the argument that the paper makes then doesn't have much to say about post-colonial positions, right? Because it's rather about economic dependencies. And of course, there is a relationship between economic dependencies and a specific colonial legacy, but this link is not really thoroughly fleshed out in the paper. And I think this is fleshed out in the paper. And I think this is something that should be done in the next version of this paper. So if one is looking at the argument in the paper, one could really rewrite the title, would say, it's the economy, stupid. Then you know what's going on in the Global South reactions to the Ukraine war. Of course, I'm not sure that the paper wants to get at that conclusion, right? And I think that there is an avenue for the paper to avoid this kind of conclusion. If it is, if you are focusing a little bit more on the kind of differentiation of the findings in these responses from the Global South to the war in Ukraine. So because in the paper, you seem to suggest that the reaction of states in the Global South in the UN, in the United Nations, in condemnation of the war or the different phases and the different decisions is also a vote on the sanctions regime, but it is not. And I think here it is getting interesting. If the voting pattern in the UN bodies is not directly linked to the acceptance of sanctions, then this might be a starting point to think about post-colonial legacies, right? Because then it's not directly about economic gains or losses. So I would suggest to really map the supporting countries' relation to the colonial past and contrasting that vis-a-vis the economic links to Russia. And I think then you might get a picture whether it is really about post-colonial or colonial legacies or about political economy or how these two are linked. At least you have a finding from which to start and discuss these different possibilities. Maybe a minor point, you talk, and I thought when I was starting on your paper, oh, wow, now I'm getting a piece about examining the media discourse in India and Germany, but actually you don't do that. You claim doing that, but then you don't do it. So I think that would be great to have that as a starting point, so that we really also get a feeling, what is the substance of the difference in argumentation, right? Okay, leave it here because I probably don't have that much time. Next paper, that was David's paper, No Theory is an Island. So what is this paper is doing? It is asking for comprehensive theory, building or theorizing, right? And there are two claims, that is include local scholars when theorizing and include local history and potentially also much more. So local expertise and knowledge in what you're doing. Now again, I think we all would agree that the explanation of specific events is aided by including specific expertise, local expertise and knowledge, no doubt about it. But I think the argument in your discussion piece goes further than that by stating that this should always be the case. So specific theories are the starting point that we need to engage with to even go about our business. However, to substantiate this claim, what I have liked to read more about would be, is there a difference in your mind between explaining general patterns in international relations and or specific events? Is there a difference in doing that and engaging in that business of explaining, or for that matter, even in describing? And if you think there is a difference, what is constituting this difference, and what are the implications for your argument? The mid-range theory call that you are engaging with in your paper actually is not a new call, right? That was a call in the late 1960s, 1970s, right? It was this, we need more mid-range theory to be better able to address also specific events. So, and I wonder, haven't made any progress since then? Are we still at that stage where we need that call again? My feeling was we are not in that area anymore where we have these highly abstract theories who are pitched against each other. We are in an age of mid-range theorizing. So I think you need to be more specific. What is your call? Your call is not about mid-range theorizing. You have a specific quality, I think, of theorizing in mind, and you need to flesh that out more explicitly in your paper. Another question that I would have for you, and this is now directly pointing at, I think, what you have in mind. How should IR scholars pick and choose local experts and local histories or cultural context or political context? So what is it that is relevant and what can we leave aside? For instance, let's look at the Ukrainian war. Wouldn't we also need to engage, of course, with Russian history, right? And shouldn't we also then include Russian scholars? Wouldn't their knowledge also be relevant, right? So why do we draw the line? What is it to be included and what is it to be left out? Great. Next paper, and I'm sorry when I'm a little bit like, like an ICE. So that's a paper by Raphael. And again, a very well-written and thought-provoking discussion piece on what our academic community should do to be better able to deal with unforeseen events like the war in Ukraine. And he has these 4 hypotheses. Think about our willingness to cooperate and or, I cannot read that anymore in public class. Second, identify gaps and lacks of expertise. Third, design and suitable fora for interdisciplinary research, and then 4, institutionalize them. And I think, again, we will all agree that, that the main tenets of these hypotheses are valid. Of course, we should be more interdisciplinary. We should engage in transdisciplinarity. We should institutionalize these fora. We're actually doing that now for decades. I'm not sure whether we will ever really succeed in reaching this complete interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary world, but at least we're doing that. So then the question is, what does this paper give us? And here I think, again, there is a lot more thought that could be going into this paper, because right now it falls too short and jumps too far. Too short because it doesn't really address the proclaimed hypotheses in any way. That is, what is the starting point? What is the state of the art of the field? What are the specific problems and crisis moments that you would highlight to have, again, this very energetic call for more inter and transdisciplinarity? What's the failures? Where are they really, right? And jumping too far, I am missing any kind of a theoretical framework or references which could support these hypotheses and the current assessment of the state of affairs. Again, there is a lot of calls for something, but it is not justified. It's not argued through. So why is, I mean, of course, we all know, but why is interdisciplinarity in the current state of the field such an important factor? I would like to know. I mean, this is IR. What is it, right? And second, what is the role of the profession? I'm thinking about Max Weber's ideas about that, but there are so many others. You could also talk about Bourdieu and so many other thinkers. What is the role of the profession? How does it feature into? So I think if you would do that, you know, infuse a little bit of theory and thinking on it, could be a great piece. And finally, that is the Dennis piece, the Germanocentrism and the challenges. So again, very thought-provoking discussion piece that doesn't as much discuss a position from the global south, as most of the papers don't, but rather focuses on Germany, Germanocentrism. And he detects this Germanocentrism of the field, or as he pointed out, a German exceptionalism sine nomine, without name. So this is quite a strong statement, actually. And if you think, like me, this is a strong statement, I can tell you it is typical for this piece that wants to provoke. This is a piece that really wants to provoke us. So, and again, I think that it does provoke, but it could do also still a better job in also justifying that provocation. And let me elaborate on that a little bit. First of all, is there a German IR with specific themes and specific theory traditions? And I think, yes, we all know this. There is a specific German IR, and we have like decades of writing about the specific German IR, how it reinvented itself in the 1990s, what kind of themes and topics and theories have been very prominent. Nobody would disagree. There's also a Scandinavian IR, there's a British IR, there's a French IR, and I could go on with that. So that's not what's at stake here. What's at stake is this a monolithic field in Germany, as this piece suggests? And I'm not sure. And I think you could do, Dennis, a better job in convincing me that this is the case, right? For instance, you refer to newer studies that highlight that there is more diversity in the German IR field by now, but then you criticize those studies as making categorical mistakes. For instance, they focus on topics, but not on paradigms, where a look into the field would reveal that all these topics belong to one central paradigm, and this is a liberal constructivist paradigm, and most of it is focusing on norms research. Being in that camp, I would love to be such an empire, but I don't think that I am. So I think you have really that sentence. Do we have 2 minutes? Okay. So well, I'm
going to let you finish that thought.
Okay. So you overlook the paradigmatic commonality of a dominant pattern of German IR. That's the claim here. So a related argument then is that German IR is paradigm centered, but is that true? Sorry, it's just a collection. So in Hamburg, we have norms research, but it's not from liberal constructivists, at least not all of it. In Frankfurt, we have pragmatism, critical theory of security and violence, and then we have this kind of rules theories going on. Is that all liberalism? We have in Bremen a critical theory of political sociology. In Berlin, we have post-colonialism. In Tübingen, we have post-structuralism. In Erfurt, we have post-structuralism. In Munich, we have realism. Oh, again, Frankfurt realism with a status orientation. Oh, Jäger and Köln is probably also realism, and it could go on forever. So there's much more diversity in the field, and I think you should take that seriously. And then how does it, even if we would agree with you that there is this monolithic liberal constructivist norm researching thing going on, how does it all relate to a call to forego policy relevance of the field? That is, you have a reference here for that on the US academic market, which has a much higher link between academia and foreign policy establishment with the back and forth of taking positions in either field in a certain historical period. I mean, the piece that you are citing is from the Cold War in the early years of the Cold War, actually. And how far does that apply to the German field, where policy relevance and these interchanges between politics and the field is much less intensive or extensive? And on top of that, where you take the claim that policy engagement would narrow the paradigmatic view and paradigmatic engagement of the field. Well, for all we know, the policy sector is picking diversity when they ask for policy advice, not monolithic. Again, I think this could be a brilliant piece, but you have to give up more argument in it, okay? So more justification. Again, thank you very, very much, and I'm so much done.
Okay, so we do have actually a good half hour for discussion, which I think is the first on a panel that I've been on. So yay, there's that. I would suggest that we stand up for 1 second, just kind of wiggle. At least I need to stand up for a moment and get my back. Tall person, all chairs, always a problem. So I'm gonna just stand up and talk if you guys don't want to stand up. German IR, I guess. And I'm going to collect questions. And if you want to ask questions over here, we have, okay, Solveig, I'm going to let you go first because you also haven't had a chance to say anything with the paper that you've been part of. And then I'm gonna try to keep, I'll do that after, but let's start with Solveig.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for providing a short space as well for me to engage with the discussion. And what I have to say to it, it's actually the best panel I've been in here in terms of technique. So we as guests, we have a brilliant bird eye perspective on the whole conference room, so we can observe, we can be part of that, and that's actually really something very engaging, because yesterday we had a total technical failure in our panel on the post-liberal, or not post-liberal, on the liberal world order, and then which was a bit disappointing for us from the distance. But now don't have that much time, so thank you again. And well, it's not actually not a paper that Siddharth has produced, a brilliant paper, and we are in constant discussions on the issue of perspectives from the Global South. So what I bring in is less now a common paper, but more part of the discussions we have on the perspectives from the Global South. And let me bring in a few points, because I had a chance to travel also to the Global South and do a lot of field research during that period of time, directly after the Russian invasion in Ukraine in Colombia. And I remember in March, I was supposed to speak with farmers, campesinos, after 5 hours of traveling into the jungle about the impact of the pandemic. And the first thing they asked me was to discuss with me the Russian war in Ukraine, far, far, far away in the Colombian jungle. So what I wanted to say about that, it's not only, so my first comment on that would be, it's not only a state-based issue, right? So it's also about societies. And what I assume is that we have a broad diversity and variety of opinions in the Global South that are non-state based about the Russian invasion. And for example, when we perceive what's happening right now in Latin America with the turnover of the first left government, for example, in Colombia, with the turnover of Bolsonaro. So we have that huge gap between what does state policy mean, or what do countries make and governments make, and what do citizens? And so, so to say, the civil society also think and perceive of that, and the broader population, which might shape also global politics in the medium term. And what I do see also are a couple of points I just want to bring in. There's a huge grievance of neglect of, so to say, Western policies over the course of the last, a few years. And that is also related, for example, to the pandemic. So people in the Global South perceive very, very well the nationalist, Eurocentric policies, for example, of vaccinations, right? So they are well aware of these inequalities and the global shifts in global order. And they are well, why do we shall now be or show solidarity to something which has not shown solidarity to us over the course of the last years? And this is one of the perception. There's also a grievance or a fear of further extraction. When I see the discussion on energy related impacts of this Russian-Ukrainian war, we do see, for example, that all of a sudden, for example, the extraction of coal and mining becomes very relevant. And when the Chancellor Scholz says, well, we need to import more coal from Colombia, then all the indigenous groups and all the local groups who are pro-democratic actors there, or at least, they stand up and say, what is this kind of an interest-based policies falling falling us in the back and not supporting us in a energy transition, in a green energy transition here in countries in the Global South. So this is well perceived, right? So, which is not often in a discussion here in Europe, I think.
I think we might need to stop there. So we have some other questions.
One thing which I would like to really add, because this is something important where we have to work on. There is a huge misinterpretation of the Russian motivations to invade Ukraine in parts of the Global South as well. So for me, there is still this huge misinterpretation that it is Russia is playing an emancipatory role for some of the weak, right? So against American imperialism. And what is important is also to work against these narratives and all that. At a later stage, I would also like to answer the question of interchange between policy field and academics to Nicole. if I have the chance, but maybe here I stop on the
Thank you. I think what we're going to do is we're going to collect questions, and then you all have to be very good at answering all the questions in one go. So just so you know that already. Okay. So I'm going to sort of ping pong back and forth. We're going to start there, and then we're going to go over here in the back. So yes. Okay. So you're going to have to keep your hands up because I also don't know everybody's name. So please just say who you are as well.
Sebastian Popper of University Berlin. I have a small comment that I turn now into a question, echoing what Nicole Deitelhoff has said. So how do you actually select the local voices? I think local here is very much a sheep or I don't know, a symbol for making obvious hierarchies, but I think it's actually more complex, and I've been involved in something that reconstructs the debate of Ukrainian historians on colonialism, which is going on for 100 years, and you have all kinds of opinions. And I mean, I would say the tendency is that they are actually very critical of this notion of colonialism, because, I mean, there were Soviet officers and some Ukrainians profited and benefited from these structures in the Soviet Union, so it's complex. And of course, it's Russian imperialism now, but is it colonial? So I think the debate is much more complex depending on what voices you bring to the fore, which then has an impact on theorizing as well. So how do you deal with it?
Thank you. Yes.
So I would like to take this opportunity also to make a loop with our debate yesterday on Zeitenwende and the implications for IR. So after the end of the Cold War, we have seen these different turns in IR, the constructivist turn, the post-structuralist turn, post-materialist, local turn, the practice turn is quite active right now. So actually there is also a global turn in IR, and there is a new ISA section on this. And this has been influenced, on this global IR has been influenced by important emerging debates, such as post-colonial knowledge production, but also intersubjective relationalities, global cosmologies, and so on. So I was wondering, how do you see this developing? Is it yet another turn in IR, or do you think it has really has the potential to develop new debates without necessarily perpetuating the existing debates, given the fact and the caveat that it also involves publishing, where we need to refer to a contribution that we want to make to a certain debate and discipline. So how do we overcome this dilemma?
Thank you. We'll take another one over here and then over here.
Thank you. Jonas Rieger from the Peace Research Institute, Frankfurt. So first to Siddharth. I was wondering about if there is such a thing, a global South perspective on the different treatments of war and crisis refugees from the MENA region or other areas in the global South compared to Ukrainian refugees. I've asked the German ambassador to the United States about this, and she told to a largely American audience, don't worry, Germany will not falter with the Ukrainian refugees because they are civilizationally close to Germans. And that would interest me then to David Bitterling. You have stressed Ukrainian history, and Nicole has added Russian history. I think that's not just another layer. I think it's really important that, especially in this time of enmity, Russian and Ukrainian histories are constructs, and in between are shared identities and networks and shared suffering. So, you know, parts of the World War II experience, serfdom, or suffering of ordinary people under the same or dissimilar autocracies, like the Soviet Union or Yanukovych on the one hand, Putin on the other. So how does this factor into your call for comprehensive approaches? How important do you think it is? How difficult do you find it to include it in these times? Then lastly, to Dennis, I was wondering how important external views on German IR are for you. I've only talked to American IR scholars, Ukrainian IR scholars, Russian IR scholars, and all of them agree that there is such a thing as German IR that is distinct from just, you know, Danish, Swedish, and so forth, that there is something about it that separates it distinctly. They don't quite agree on what it is, but they will recur to sometimes meanly they call it a post-conflict bias or a liberal bias or a constructivist bias, but then it's frayed at the margins. And I would be interested in what kind of role that plays for you and how you, if you integrate it at all. Thank you.
All right. This is going to be very hard, people. I hope you're taking good notes. Okay, we have 2 questions right here. So.
Good time, I'm Frankfurt. I have a question actually to all of you on the panel, which I think is in principle fairly simple, and it links up to what you all have in one way or another referred to. That is this multiplying of perspectivity, the fact that we need to go beyond paradigmatism, that we should emphasize theorizing, possibly less so, more so than mid-range theorizing, at least in my understanding of David's paper, that we should look into history, etc. And Raphael adding, as others did to some extent too on the panel, that's not new, these kinds of calls. We've heard that done for decades. My simple question is, why do you think that we have been repeating these kinds of calls and not acting on them? I have a few speculations. I will not offer them here, but I'm just curious as to what you think the explanation is, why we are only calling for these kinds of things and not acting on them.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for all the presentations. My name is Andrea Gabrich. I'm holding the chair on international integration and Eastern Europe at the Justus Liebig University of Gießen. You can eventually already get from this that my life has been fully changing also since the February, and I'm collaborating with Ukrainian researchers and students every week, nearly every day. I have a couple of projects also with Ukrainian researchers, so the perspective is very, very close to me. I have a couple of also comments to this very insightful presentations. I start with Siddharth. I was very curious if for the Global South, this has not been a turning point of Zeitenwende, so how to theorize it then instead? I had to give a talk to the Taiwanese Political Science Association on the war last week or 2 weeks ago, and the German debate on the war, and for sure for them it's a very existential Zeitenwende. But could you theorize in a different way? That would be very interesting to get to know. Then to David, I fully agree with you in all what I observed, that history is like not really covered as it should be. I would like to add, and Holodomor for sure as well, I would like to add World War II. And add then to what Nicole said, it's not their history, it's also our history. What happened there during World War II, during the German occupation there, it's also our history, what is part of their memory. I don't know if you observed the debates on how to save Holocaust survivors in Ukraine. This was at the first moment done by international Jewish organizations and only very late by the German government. Only very, very late the German government noticed that we have this responsibility in this regard. So it's our joint history in this regard. And what does it make for our art? It would be very interesting to get to know. Then finally on Raphael and the issue of self-orientation, like on too narrow perspective from IR studies. From my perspective, I would think there needs to be a better bridge between IR and comparative regionalism with regard to authoritarian foreign policy. If you want to understand this war, we need very much to understand what type of authoritarian regime we have in Russia, how it goes now towards totalitarian system in order to understand foreign policy motives, capabilities, and so on and so on. We need this bridge between IR and comparative politics, especially with regard to authoritarian research. As short as possible.
Thank you. Okay, we have 3 more hands, so we're going to make it through, and then you all get your time. Okay, in the back.
Yeah, this
my name, and thanks for very interesting papers, and especially now on the Southern perspective. But I wonder whether there are not certain further factors. For example, looking at the Indian case, one could say perhaps they also want to extract certain concessions from the US, better weapons later on at the cheaper price, or that they want also cover for their action in Kashmir. And so But that points to a larger question. What kind of a theoretical take do you take on that issue? You know, how do you explain theoretically their behavior? Concerning David, different paradigms have different ontological grounds, epistemological approaches, and are they really fitting? And how does one go about it? You know, if one would advise a PhD student how to put it together, you know, does it really fit or not, and so on. So you might want to explore that a little bit. And lastly, Dennis, a lot has been already said about the field, but I would be interested if one has the statement that there is a specific German IR, how to explain it, you know, what are the forces that led to that, because otherwise it would be rather difficult to see and to say in which direction it should go, you know, because if one doesn't quite understand what leads to the specifics of German IR in its heterogeneity, I think one cannot really say anything about where it might go and how it should go there.
Great, thank you. Then here, and then no more questions. Sorry, people. We're gonna give the panel a chance.
Elvira Rosa at University Hamburg. Yeah. Thank you very much. I have two comments. One for Siddharth. So thank you very much for outlining the perspective, also the differentiated perspective of the Global South on this conflict. What I found interesting is your remark that hinted to the perception of Ukraine as the West. So supporting Ukraine is supporting the West in this case. And I think it's not a natural perspective on Ukraine, because until 30 years ago, it has been part of another bloc. And I think this is important because this kind of helps to resolve the dilemma for the Global South to take positions in that particular conflict. Because if we strip off its geographical context, it's a very big empire attacking a small and weak neighbor. So you would not expect that it's so difficult to take a clear stance on that. But then if you redefine Ukraine as part of the West, then it becomes easier maybe to ease those tensions that you may perceive in some parts, at least, of the Global South. And still the support for Ukraine and the Western position is very, very high. So we just have, I don't know, 30 abstentions, not even no's for those positions. My second point is for David, and I will just follow up on what Nicole said, and I will be maybe even more provocative on that. So I think to argue for eclectic theorizing is setting up a straw man here, because the implication is that there are some people outside who would argue for paradigmatic theorizing as an opposite position. And since it happened here yesterday at another panel, I think what we have here is a mistaken equation between assessing the relative strength of different theoretical hypotheses and fighting paradigm wars. And it's not the same thing. So the challenge here is rather, and I think we have to face that challenge, to assess the relative strength of certain paradigms for specific cases without then going to more general assessment about the universal validity or application of the theory. So I maybe would not that much engage with fighting the paradigm wars argument, but rather think of, so what is it that we need to do really good eclectic theorizing here, and how do we deal with that relative strength with case-specific explanations, and then maybe broader conclusions for theories.
Thank you. Okay, last but not least, and then we'll go down.
Thank you. Sasan Guliaga, European University, Viadrina. I have one question. I'm not sure in which paper this appeared, but there were a couple of times the talk about the objective research. And I'm wondering how this language fits in with the call for reflexivity, because objects are not for agencies, objects do not speak, objects are only observed from some sort of Archimedean point, right? And we can have a neutral, but that is not, we talk about Ukraine as an agent, we talk about civilians, that these are not objects in research in my view. So I think if there's a call for self-reflexivity, then this is one of the terms we probably should get rid of. because objects are sort of not, I think, the right term if we want to look at agency and listen actually to voices. And then on the question of sort of interdisciplinarity and theorizing, I'm a big fan of interdisciplinarity. I think it's helpful, but I would also say that it sometimes would be helpful to look at what the own discipline already offers on diverse perspectives. Sometimes we don't need to travel to international law or history or sociology or whatever, because we do have approaches already within IR, even within the German IR, from post-colonialism to feminism. Nicole pointed to all of that. And sometimes it helps to travel outside the own institutional bubble to find alternative perspectives without needing to shift disciplines, right? This is not a call against interdisciplinarity, but from the own disciplinary perspective before you start sort of crawling through other disciplines, I would say. Thank you.
Quantum physics, I will only on that
Thank you.
Yeah. So we're going to go down the panel. I'm going to then bring in our online people. So we have 9 minutes. So you get 2-ish. So pick something. I don't think you can answer everything.
Yeah,
right?
a couple of minutes we have to theorize, look at all the hierarchies that exist, and just to okay, I'm in time pressure. I agree with Nicole's comments, and maybe I should have written that the paper is co-authored with Ausländer behavior, because that's where I've spent my last few months trying to be legally working here. But I agree with the points. I'm aware of the sort of challenges, but it was more of a discussion paper. And thank you so much for giving like a very clear guideline on how many papers can come out of that one discussion piece. Jonas, thank you for bringing out this whole hierarchization which exists on and this racialized sort of idea of refugees. I think it reminds me of Mahmoud Mamdani's piece, where he talks about good Muslims and bad Muslims. And if we'll bring that here, it will be good refugees, bad refugees. And I've been following the discourse here, especially when it comes to the discourse. And a lot of colleagues and friends have talked about the refugees and saying that, yeah, but these are women and children who are coming, and whereas the others are white men, brown, black men who are coming. And I felt that it's this underlying tone is that they are coming to take away our women. I mean, and it's really, we can discuss more and, on that, but yeah. And sometimes I'm also, people think I'm Arab, and then, they also, I also feel how the distancing works there, so it's also very personal in that sense. Gunter, I think, why do we not act? We need to talk to you about that, that in terms of the structures that have existed for long. And when we look at also the point about new debates and dilemmas, I think, that question already answers, that why have we not done? Because, we've not really dealt with all the things which have been there or existed, say, in the last few decades. And then that's something, IR, wherever it is, we have not been able to discuss those things, whether it's India, whether it's Germany, whether, US, wherever it is, right? And only now it's being discussed. And I guess, there have been certain efforts, and we are all part of that, and trying to sort of do a bit of self-reflexivity, and also in terms of the hierarchies which exist, not only epistemologically, but also structurally and in so many other ways. So I guess we're all trying to do that, but yeah, there's a lot of scope. I will come to the question of Kashmir later. I guess I don't have time because, yeah, but I will. It's not like I'm trying to evade that question. Yeah, So
all right.
I want to give out time.
Thank you. If we have more time, I can come back to you, yes. But I have a feeling you might not. Dennis.
Yeah. Many thanks for your comments. I could relativize to some extent, but also, the 60% figure of people interested in those two paradigms is still showing the direction of a certain what I wanted to underline. And of course, it was a discussion paper, so I can fill it in with some figures related to ESI or ISA participation from Germany. What kind of papers are there? I have time to do that, and also to all the professorships in Germany. You can always find some different professorships or different focal points, but my point is more about the weightier one, let's say. but there are things to fill in. I didn't understand only the last point about policy advice. If I understood correctly, you said policy advice is quite diverse. It's okay, so I noted. Okay, thank you. With regard to the question of outsiders looking at Germany, I feel myself as a relative outsider, perhaps newcomer under Corona conditions. I arrived here 2 years ago. I mean, I'm meeting some of my colleagues at the department for the first time. I see your name on the door next to my door, but it's the first time. And both of your names I referred, I study global air and so on, but it's nice to see some faces. So that's the positionality perhaps. But that's perhaps the reason that I wanted to share this kind of outsider look in that sense. One short thing about the question by Professor Hellman. I think three things could stand out. One of them is stock taking. We usually generationally have to do this stock taking exercise to see what has been done, what is left unaccomplished. And then there were already yesterday some discussions about generation. So there is generational forgetting and rediscovery. And I think there was a paper on that, or at least a paragraph in a paper like 5 years ago, but I don't remember which one. There was exactly this discussion. And there is also self-positioning, of course. You need to constantly self-position yourself and point your own position. At the end of the day, with regard to dynamics, I pointed out to the societal and political conditions that prevail in post-Cold War, post-reunification Germany. And that's the reason that I called for deparochializing it by bringing in new insights and more cooperation to kind of detach oneself from this societal political conditions, which I assume to be the dynamics that shape scholarly research agenda. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I'm also going to try to be very breezy and run through this. Nicole, thank you very much for those points. I appreciate all of them. For the questions, I think for one of them, I don't have an answer yet. I have to figure that out for myself after today. That is the question, what difference there is, or I see at least, between explaining patterns and events, and what, if there's a difference, what this is constituted by. I don't have an answer for that yet. I'm going to try to figure one out. Second question, let me try to refine it. Yes, it was, I think, echoed a few times in the room, how to pick local knowledge. What is to include, and whether Russian scholarship is to be included. And well, I don't have an answer yet for the first question. To this one, I think I don't have a good one yet, but a mediocre one. I would say yes, absolutely. We do have to include a degree of Russian scholarship, for instance. What I was trying to argue for was not just to, even though I think that is very important, to incorporate the, so to speak, victim perspective, but to incorporate as much as we can and to trespass, to steal that again, as widely as possible. And that absolutely includes, I'm also going to the other comments with that, that absolutely includes Russian perspectives and history, and of course also World War II. And there are definitely also the shared experiences within Europe that, of course, Germany has had a very tragic part in. And the question of how to select local voices, maybe I'm understanding, so to speak, or under complexifying this question, but I think you would likely select it like you would, at least if it's voices from the research community, like you would much else if you take other research sources and read widely. And I think the question is less about what to select, but sort of where to and when to stop reading. And I think that would be just a moment of theoretical saturation if one can figure out when that is. To just quickly jump to your question, Gunther, I think there are many reasons probably why we have to rehave these discussions. And no, I don't think we're stuck in the 60s. And but yeah, I think two problems might be one, visibility or attempts at visibility, which are for researchers very understandable, but can, I think, sometimes lead to sort of paradigmatic approach. And it might be a byproduct of teaching, because we tend to teach one theory after another and potentially accidentally reinforce, what I would call something too school-based, so to speak. I don't want to steal all the time, so I'm going to cut it there.
Thank you. There's always a break. You can talk more, but the people online can't. So, Raphael, maybe you want to come in, and then we'll end with you, Solveig.
Yeah, I'm going to be very quick, I promise. Starting with Nicole's comment, thank you very much for that. And I mean, obviously, I mean, you're completely right. There is no real theorizing so far. It says I have not sort of like hatched that within what would be important and interesting. It was just like the first blurb. And also, I mean, I can say that in all honesty, also for me to actually see whether or not this notion at all would actually fly. As I've been mentioning before, for some time now, I have sort of like, ping pong back and forth between IR and international law to see whether or not it's sort of like only my subjective impression or whether there might be something more to it. But judging from what you have been saying also in the room and what I've been following through, I think it's worth putting a lot more effort into that and actually get started with the proper parts as well. Very briefly on the question raised by Gunther Hermann. So there have been these calls for interdisciplinarity, and so why don't we act accordingly? I would completely agree with this point on teaching, for example, and also add that it can simply be quite a lot of work to really, delve into neighboring disciplines. I mean, if it starts with, catching up on the most important reading that, might also be interesting for your teaching and research. And this is just quite a lot of effort. And I mean, we all know how our schedules look. And I think oftentimes it's just like this, it's just like a pragmatic reason not to actually, go into the neighboring turfs that often, at least. And if you do so, you do it like on purpose and for a given context. This brings me to question number 2, which was raised by Andrea Gabriel, I think, regarding this comparative regionalism as one example where it would be good to bridge, between IR and these in this subfield. This is exactly what I actually wanted to raise in the first place, like that. I mean, interdisciplinarity is not meant to be a purpose in itself. It's actually, I think it should be tailored, towards these moments of where do we actually need that, for which context do we need that, and this is when we actually engage in interdisciplinary collaboration, and not just for the sake of it. I mean, this is, I think, not what the argument would be. And this finally brings me to Sasan. I mean, exactly that, right? We have to also ask ourselves what, the discipline already has to offer, whether this actually might be, sufficient or enough, or whether we are fine with, with using that for what we actually want to reach and as a result. Completely agree. And in the best sense of, this conference and the panel, then I start with actually, or not start, but I actually engage in self-reflexivity and say, well, objects of research in the context of Ukraine, you're completely right, it's not a good fit. I actually wanted to sort of like, generalize it a bit more, like this general constellation as to how do we actually approach topics from different angles, from different perspectives. But I completely agree with you in this particular context. Object is probably not the most suitable term to refer to.
Thank you, Raphael. Solveig, you have 2 minutes, and then we're going to cut you off because we need a coffee break.
It is absolutely easy to cut me off since you just need to turn off the electricity. But thank you. Quickly. One view I wanted to share with you, or one perspective, is that I in all these critical voices and diversified voices from the global south, I do think that there's a huge consensus behind still that there is a Russian aggression, right? So for me, it was more surprising to see the broad backing up of the resolutions in the UN, right? So it was more than expected, to be honest, also during the last year. So it was more than expected. More countries openly supported the resolution, and more countries, or less countries than expected, abstained, and less countries than expected actually voted against this resolution. So there is, based on this, and that's my takeaway for IR, we also have to decenter IR in what way. We have to diversify our assumptions about what creates a peaceful world order, and we have to really be much more straightforward in arguing and looking into what constitutes and what might constitute a peaceful world order beyond merely liberal, neoliberal, and liberal democratic assumptions. But how can we build a maybe post-liberal world order, for example, with other forms of democracy, not autocracies? I'm not talking about creating like a turn into an autocratic world, but how can we integrate other voices from the South, for example, that call for more participatory democracy, more egalitarian democracy, for more economic equality in the world? And I do think that's a task which we do have also in our German IR in terms of decentering. So moving beyond this merely liberal democratic peace and world order assumptions and looking a little bit more into what might constitute a peaceful world order.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for great presentations, great questions, good conversation, and being here early in the morning, really, let's be honest. Okay.